This is a video I'm putting together for Men's Shed Association in the UK. Mainly actually how to do dovetails. So these are some dovetails that we do on some short courses we have. This little beginners little letter rack that we do. So the end of here is some through dovetails. So when we have dovetails, we have different components. The tails themselves, the pins coming through here, the end grain you can see, and on the end there we have half pins. These are through dovetails. On the back here we have a lap dovetail. So a lap basically leaves a lip of timber on the outside edge. This one, actually we've got a lap dovetail going into side grain, but normally when we do lap dovetails they are for drawers like this one, and most of the time the lap dovetails are actually going into end grain. So here we've got some English white oak going into some English brown oak, so you get a really nice strong contrast. So for this one we've got smaller dovetails on the end and some larger dovetails in the middle. So they don't always have to be exactly the same size, you can change the style to suit yourself. Fantastic strong joint, really good for your hand skills, very, very good mechanically, but once the glue's on there it's just a brilliant joint, it's just not going to fail. So I've got set out here my kit ready for making up my dovetails with. Pencil is going to be really important, so I've got quite a soft HB pencil which I might use purely for marking at my face side and my face edge. Got to make sure your timber is good and clean and square, nice square end, so I've machined that, or we'd hand plane it, no problem at all. I've also got a 2H pencil, that's hard, and number 2 means it's relatively hard as well. We can get a really clean, crisp line with that. Or otherwise a mechanical pencil, 0.5mm lead HB should be good for any clean marking out we're doing. A marking gauge, that's a wheel marking gauge I'll be using. Either going to be using a sliding bevel or a dovetail marker, I should say, 1/8 angle. A little double square going to be using, or could use a little engineer square. I don't tend to use carpenter squares, I just like a higher level of accuracy. Little 150mm ruler, a couple of scalpels, Swann Morton scalpels, really sharp, very easy to keep sharp, or replacement blades otherwise. 3 chisels set out for the right size, so I've got those sharpened up earlier on, they're going to be good to go. I tend to put on them actual chisel covers to make sure they're not getting knocked about on the bench. My dovetail saw, so that's a 20 TPI rip dovetail saw. If I was using a thicker timber, maybe like this one, then I might go to more of a 15 TPI. You don't have too many teeth in the timber, it'll overwork the timber. What we're using is a English sweet chestnut, 12mm thick. This 20 TPI is going to be great for that material. Also then going to use a piercing saw, or you may want to use a coping saw, and I'll show you that as well. I tend to use a piercing saw, it's a finer blade, a bit easier for me to use. A mallet and a hammer just for chopping out my material and also just assembling come the end. Bench hook, and I've actually got this one set up with an angle which is 1:8, or a 1:8 ratio I should say, because that's a standard angle for English dovetails. This one I set up earlier, I've drawn a square line down, I've drawn over 1 centimetre, I've measured down 8 centimetres and then put a diagonal line through the two. That gives me a ratio of 1:8. You could do 1:5 or 1:6, that's more for softwoods. For hardwoods, generally in the UK, we go with 1:8, maybe even 1:9, but that's getting really quite square. But for really fine dovetails, that might be what you're looking to do. I'll get myself set up and we'll start marking out and cut these dovetails. So one of the first things I'll do, make sure I've got good clean timber, nice and square, good square ends. Either squared up with a shooting board, or otherwise I've done that on my table saw or maybe a mitre saw. If your timber's not square and accurate and the same thickness, life's going to get a lot more tricky for you. One of the first things we're going to do is mark a shoulder line across here, which is what I've got on these dovetails that I've cut a few years ago. The shoulder line can be cut either with a marking gauge, or it could be cut with your square and a scalpel. For drawers, as I showed you in that brown oak piece earlier on, quite often on drawer making, the shoulder line will be seen all the way across the timber, even when the drawer is finished. For the outside of the carcass, quite often you actually don't want to see the shoulder line. It's very much a personal decision. Some people say, I want to see the shoulder line there forever. It means it was handmade. Some people say it was handmade, but the guy put the marks in the wrong place. So whatever you want to actually do with that. I'm going to show you at the moment how to do your marking lines all the way across. Really important to get a good, crisp, sharp marking line. So this is a marking gauge. This is a wheel marking gauge. You can use a traditional cutting gauge, and often I will use that as well. But this marking gauge will be good for cutting across the grain, good for marking with the grain, so it's quite adaptable. For this one, to set him up, we can either get him somewhere near and then set him up with the rule to the exact size, actually about 1 millimetre off. This is 12mm thick timber. For this one, what you can do, if you want to use your rule, I've just fastened off that knob there. So if you want to actually get it adjusted, you can spin this one and get him right to your 12mm. Once you've got him the right size, you can lock him off and physically you're good to go. The other way of setting it up, if you've already got your material set up, sit the material down on here, undo the knobs and get him sat on there nice and upright, and if I push that down, that is now down to exactly the same thickness as my timber. Get those ones locked off and we've now got the shoulder line set up. You can use him up against that end grain and do a good clean shoulder line all the way across. You want a good crisp shoulder line because what that's going to give you is a line for your chisel to sit into. I'll do that on both pieces. So if you didn't want to put a shoulder line all the way across the outside of your timber, then what I would do is just put a bit of a mark on there to get the exact right length, and then I would use a square of my knife just to mark in between where the timber is going to come out later on. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to go all the way across. So I've got those two bits marked out ready to go. I tend to cut my tails first. Other people will cut their pins first. I do tails. I'm going to use the tails to mark out the other half of the joint and trace around it. Putting my timber in the vise, don't have him in there too high because it'll rattle. Get him down relatively low. What I've also got in the vise at the other end here is another piece of scrap material which has got a piece of masking tape on it just to stop that vise from racking around. It's just going to hold it a little bit better. If I get my timber down, I always have my face side facing me, okay? End grain up in the vise, nice and square. Different ways we can mark out these end grain lines on here. I'll show you two different methods. This is an INCRA rule and a mechanical pencil. The INCRA rule's got hundreds of little holes through it. So if I put this INCRA T rule up against my edge of my timber, and if I come down here, we've got 1/2 millimetre measurements and these are full millimetre measurements. I've got my drawing. My drawing says my first mark is going to come in by 4 millimetres. So I drop this in the 4 millimetre line. Next line across is 29 millimetres. That's 4 plus 25. So the good thing with this rule is you can just literally add the numbers up. 4 millimetres again comes to 33. 33 plus another 25 millimetres comes to 58. And what we have now is all of the lines coming across. If I take my little double square, I can put him on here and square those lines across. When you're using your square on here, you want to try and make sure you've got majority of your steel actually on the timber. If I come across here now, it's going to start getting a bit wobbly. So the best thing to do is flip that square over and come from the other direction. Onto there. And onto there. I'll show you another way of actually marking out if you haven't got a INCRA rule, how we can just use our ruler and also the square. I'll flip them over and do the other end. So for this one I would use then a H2 pencil. I've got this really sharp. I basically carved it into a nice sharp shape, but also from that to improve the edge I've got some fine paper, and what I'm going to do is just get a nice flat edge, flip this over 180 degrees, another flat edge, and we now have more of a kind of chisel point rather than a round line. So what I'm going to do now is use a rule and a square. Again, I'm going to come in from this one end. My first measurement is 4mm in. So I will actually use my rule to push my square across to that 4mm. When I'm happy I'm there, I'll just bring this line across at 4mm. My next line should be 25mm from the 4mm line. But if I've made a mistake with my first 4mm line and I put an extra 25mm, it means this next mark is also going to be wrong. So I'm better to say 4 plus 25 is 29. So come 29mm from the outside edge. Get him on there and hold him. If this was a wider bit of timber, I'd probably just keep on going. But what's going to happen in a minute, I'm going to start getting right near the edge and have nothing to hold on to. So if I flip this timber around, if I come from the other side, again, I'm going to come 4mm. 4 plus 25 is 29. And we're good to go. Just double check, your middle one looks right, looks pretty damn close to the 4mm. I think we're good to go. For me, again, what I would always have the face side facing me. So I'm going to turn him around this way. I'm now going to use either my sliding bevel or my dovetail marker. I'll show you how to set the sliding bevel up, but I'll probably actually use my dovetail marker. I just find it a bit easier to use. So I've got my bench hook set up with my ratio of 1:8. If I take my sliding bevel, I can bring him along and set him up to that angle, lock him off, and that's good to go. Otherwise, I could use my dovetail marker, which is preset to that 1:8 ratio, because it's such a common angle or ratio to be used in dovetailing. So on this old example, I've got my square lines marked across the end grain. Now I need to do my slopes for my dovetails. So we could use the sliding bevel. So it's set to the right angle. So it sits on the top here, and we can mark down that angle on the outside of that one. We can come across and we can mark that one. We don't want to get too close to the other end again and we start wobbling. We can either flip this over and we can flip him around the other way. So it can be actually set up 4 different ways or moved for getting all of those different angles. Be careful when you do it, don't spike yourself. These can be set up so it comes out a lot longer. I tend to have it around the halfway point. But I won't be using that. I'm actually going to use my dovetail marker to set mine up. So what I'm going to do now is actually mark out my slopes. This dovetail marker can sit on the top edge. I'm going to draw a nice crisp pencil line down to my shoulder line. So I've marked out my first 2 angles. Now I need to actually do the angle coming back the other slope. So I flip this over end to end, and now I can draw my slope coming back in the other way. The dovetails go from wide at the top down to narrow. What we're going to remove is this waste material in here. I'm going to flip this around, mark the other side as well. And again, just marking where the waste is going to be. So I've marked out my dovetail slopes. I need now to mark out the line across here for the shoulder line. So I put that in the vise. I could use my marking gauge, but it can be a little bit tricky balance wise. So I tend to normally use my number 3 scalpel with a 10A blade and my square. Always put the stock of the square against your face side. So I put him in against the face side. Don't try and bring the square up to the line. If you drop the scalpel into the line and bring your square up to it, it'll be much more accurate. Square that line across, and again, we know that's going to be the waste. Flip him over, and I'll do exactly the same from the other side. knife into there, square up to it, square that line across. What that line has done, when I've put my knife on there, rather than going upright, I've actually leaned my knife over just about 5 or 10 degrees, done a good square line, and what's actually happened, the line is basically square down and a V across, and the V is always into where the waste timber will be. This means our chisel will also sit with a flat side against the flat side of that line, and the V going into what will be the waste part of the timber. That gives you a really crisp line to work to. If you just did that with a pencil, your chisel would be walking all over the place. With a good crisp line, you'll find your chisel will actually find that and hold it. So I have my timber, I've got my waste parts marked out. I always have the face side facing me. That's the side that's always going to be seen for forevermore. Don't have him too high in the vise, have him fairly low down. What I'm going to do, I've got my timber so it's nice and level in the vise. I'm going to take my dovetail saw and I'm going to saw just on the waste side of the line, okay? You see where the waste is marked out. I'm going to make sure my saw is almost kissing that line. What you do not want to do is bring your saw to the other side of it, because actually now what was 25mm will become smaller because you'll have a saw cut and a saw cut inside your finished lines. For me, I tend to do this with my timber nice and level at the top, but what that does mean, I've got to go square across. I've actually got to kick my saw over at that angle. You may struggle to do that, so if you are struggling to do that, there's a couple of ways you can get over it. If you actually set your timber up so it is sloping, that 1/8, now we'll actually have his nice upright plumb cuts. And then when you go to the other dovetail, flip it over and set him up for that angle. And that will give you nice plumb cuts, which might be easier for you. But I'll bring him round to square and I'll go from there. I'm right-handed, so for me, I've got my saw in my hand. I've got a 3-finger grip. I've got 1 finger pointing where I'm going. I'm going to basically stand like a boxer, but with a locomotion movement, so on a nice straight action. Don't crowd the saw, because what you'll end up doing is doing that. You'll bend the saw and you won't get a very clean finish on your dovetail. And the idea is we're trying to pretty much hit these lines and try and finish this joint off the saw. Most important thing is to go nice and square. If the angles vary a bit, that isn't so critical, because what we're going to do later is trace around this onto the other half of the joint. And any slight variation in the angle, most people wouldn't actually ever see. First cut I'm going to do, I'm going to actually start cutting very fractionally uphill, just using a few teeth till I get the saw established. Then I'll bring him level and use more of the length of the saw. The first cut I do, I'm putting my saw to the waist side of that line. This for me is a fairly easy cut being right-handed. I can see the pencil line. I'm going to use my knuckle just to start off where that saw is cutting. Nice and square, down on that angle, blowing the dust away as I go, and getting just so I come down to clip that line. I'll come across, I'll do this one the same again. Square across in the waist side of the line, get the saw established and cut all the way down. The next cut is a bit more tricky. I've got to go to the other angle, but also now I can't see the pencil line. The pencil line is on the other side of the saw. So for me, I have to actually look over the top of the saw to see the pencil line. As you do that, you can find your body takes the saw with you, so it can be a little bit more tricky. You could say, well, why don't you just turn the timber around, so you're always doing angle cuts that way, and you could do that, but I tend to find people are much better at following the line they can see, and it's very difficult to follow the line at the back. If you're not careful, what will happen, your dovetails end up looking quite scruffy. So I always tend to work from the outside face that's always going to be seen. So I'll come to cut this one here, and I'm just leaning over the top of the saw just a little bit, just going inside the waist and coming down to that shoulder line. Same for the last one. blowing the dust away, just coming down to that finished shoulder line. So what I'm going to do now is remove where one of these pins will be coming into later on. Various ways of doing it. Some people put it on the bench and literally chop it all out. The English way of doing it generally is to use a piercing saw. You can use a coping saw, and I'll show you that slightly later. The piercing saw is a nice fine blade. I've got the teeth pointing backwards, so it's always cutting on a back stroke. This saw is nice and fine and actually will sit within the saw kerf that I've already produced. My coping saw would be wider, and what it would actually do is end up making a mess of that nice clean line that I've produced. I'm going to put the saw down and a little bit of sideways pressure to start spinning that saw over. I'm about 1 millimetre above the shoulder line, and I'm going to cut across. As I get to the end, the tone will change and that bit pops out. So I'm trying to leave myself a minimal amount of chiselling, probably just 1 millimetre or so. You could chop it all out, but then you're chopping out 12 millimetres worth of timber rather than 1 millimetre's worth, and that's going to blunt your chisel 12 times quicker. So what I'm going to do now is remove this bit of timber out of this corner here. So I'm going to use for that my dovetail saw. This actually is a rip dovetail saw. So ripping generally means you should be using that for ripping with the grain. But what we're doing now actually is going across the grain. So you could have a rip saw and a separate crosscut saw. This is a handmade English saw. This is a Pax 1776. This is a really good quality saw, and it'll go actually very well with the grain and cross-cutting, so it's my saw of choice, to be honest. The other one I'll tend to use is a Veritas, probably half the price. Again, a very nice saw to be using. The way I will do this, again, I know where my waist is. Make sure my saw is on the waist side of the line. I'm going to use my thumb again as a bit of a guide, and I'm going to bring this saw maybe 0.5 millimetre in the waist side of the line if I can. Just get him started, get him established, blow the dust away, saw down to meet the other cut that we've done. And we're just leaving a little bit of material in there, 0.5 millimetre or so, to clean up with a chisel. When I did my sawing earlier on, the rip cut I did down this direction, I'll be finishing that off the saw is my plan. For my cross cut, I would never tend to finish off the saw. I will always improve this cut with one of my chisels. Saw that waist out, down to meet the other pre-cut line, and do that final bit of chiselling. So I'm ready to start removing this centre section here where my pin is going to come in later on. So I'm using a 6mm or 1/4 inch chisel, nice and sharp. It's got fine lands or edges. It's a bevel edge chisel. We want the bevel so we get in here without any bruising. If we used a mortise chisel, it would bruise the corners here. It wouldn't be very good. Again, I'm standing like a bit of a boxer. I'm going to pinch the chisel with this hand, and I'm going to push with the other. This English sweet chestnut is really quite soft. So for this timber, I can literally just do pushing and cutting in. If there was harder timber or a lot more to be done, I may do this chopping on the bench, and I'll show you that later on with the other half of the joint. So I've got a nice crisp shoulder line. I'm not going to go right down to that shoulder line quite yet. I'm just going to see if I can push this in about 2/3 the way across. Use my thumb just to break out that little tiny bit of timber that's left there. And get this in here. And I'm going to slightly undercut this joint. Not dead level, just fractionally undercutting, but it's very, very small amount. I'm going to turn the timber around and do from the other side. So I turn him around, faces now, that's going to be the face to be seen later on. Get him nice and squared upright in the vise. Same again, I'm going to pinch that chisel, push with this one, just remove this little bit of waste that's left in the middle. I never go down to the finish line straight away because the chisel does have a wedge effect and can actually, let me just push that out of the way just with my little rule just for a moment, get some of that waste out of there. Just about 0.5 mm to finish off. That chisel should find that knife line or gauge line and just come across. You've got to be careful with this method because you're pushing in. If you push all the way through, you could have breakout. Don't think your finger's going to stop it. All you can do is end up stabbing yourself. I want to make sure it's nice and clean on the inside face there. So one thing I'd use is actually one of my rulers, and put it in here. If it's nice and square across the bottom, this won't wobble. It'll come back to a physical stop. That looks pretty good. How clean are the corners? There might be a little bit of junk in here. Does this come down? Yeah, actually, oh, you can hear a little bit of jump. There's a little tiny step in the corner there. What about the other side? That one's pretty good. So there's just something very small in this corner just to come out. And that was probably it. So that is clean. I think that one's good to go. Next thing to do is to clean up these outside edges, which I will get another chisel for doing that with. So I'm ready to clean up this little shoulder in here. I could use a nice wide chisel and just push in, but I know from my own experience that I tend to undercut. Exaggerating, I tend to do that. And then what you end up with is a line actually undercut. So if you're really good and get it level every time, go with a wide chisel. Otherwise, I use a chisel which is slightly narrower than my timber. That was 12mm. I'm going with a 9mm or 3/8 of an inch chisel. If I just get slightly above that shoulder line and just push that chisel in, just removing the centre section of that timber, I'm down to that shoulder line. I'm now going to use that same chisel to remove the little 2mm bit here or 2mm bit there, rather than just pushing straight forward. If you do that, you might get breakout on here. If I go from this side and do them with a slicing action in towards the middle and a slicing action back towards the middle, we'll probably get really clean little shoulders here. Again, it's a very minimal cut that I'm doing. Same from this side. And then there's just a little tiny bit to clean up in the corner. Don't bang this with a mallet. You'll have breakout in the corners there. Just watch out these corners. You don't want to hit that with a mallet. You'll split your timber. Just clean out those corners. What I do now is use the tails that I've cut nice and square across, and I'm going to use those actually to mark onto the second half of the joint. I'm going to mark and scribe around that so the second part matches up to it. Never go to the drawing and try and measure it and make the other half independently and see if they come together. The chances are it just won't work. I'm going to have my face side facing towards me again. Get him in the vise, a scrap bit of timber, bring him so he's level and flush to a scrap bit of timber. Move that timber away. What we're going to do, we're going to sit this pair of tails on top of here and get him resting on that bit of timber. If you did it just straight onto the bench, and if there was just the slightest bit of timber or waste in here, you'd find this thing would pivot and spin. Very difficult to hold. Much easier to hold actually if he's up on there. We can put some pressure to hold this down in the right position. I want to get this positioned front to back so my internal shoulder line matches up to the inside of my timber. Not necessarily the outside of my tails being flush, because you may find actually your tails are slightly over, which means you've got to plane down a bit more of the end grain. Or it could be later on actually they are slightly shallow and then you plane down more of that timber. The shoulder line internally is the thing to work to. I'm going to use my engineer's square, sit him on here, bring that so it's level to this outside edge, and then you'll find that this bit of timber will just slide up and down this. This is holding it square, but also holding it in line left to right. If I bring him down so my shoulder line is just touching the internal face, I'm now going to use a Swann Morton scalpel again. This is a number 4 handle and a 26 blade. This is a longer blade. Very, very fine blade. This will get into the finest of dovetails. I'm going to use this to mark out exactly where my internal edges are. I want to make sure this knife line is really tight up against the dovetails that I've already cut. I'm leaning the knife in. When I come to the other edge, I'm going to lean the knife the other way, in towards that edge, and again the same in the middle. If I could get a pencil in there to mark it, that would be great, but I physically wouldn't be able to get a pencil in here, and particularly if I made these pins any smaller. If I remove that, I can now see these lines with my knife. I've got to make sure I'm now removing these larger bits are going to be my waste parts of the timber to be sawn and chiselled out in a moment. What I'm going to do now is actually square my lines down. I'm going to actually use the pencil for doing this. If I put my square on the top, line it up to where the knife lines are I've just drawn, and square a line down. Bring the square across, square the line down. I'm going to flip the square around and come from the other side. You always want the majority of the stock of the square on the timber. And then ready for the last one. I'm going to do exactly the same on the internal face. Nice fine pencil line. If possible, try and get that pencil line so it comes down to the shoulder and not much further. If I do a line a long way down, I'll do one. I've then got to actually end up removing all this line later on by sanding or hand planing. It's just making an extra job for yourself. So if you can, try and get your line to pretty much finish where your shoulder line is. Also, on a marking the waist to come out, the same from this side, and that's going to be ready for sawing. Now it's going to be ready for the sawing. We must make sure we've marked out where the waist is going to be. We must make sure that our saw always comes in the waist side of that line. If we come to the outside of that line, our half pins and full pins will be getting too narrow. They've got to match up to the other half of the joint. Again, I'm going to use my rip saw. This is a ripping cut. We're cutting down with the grain. Again, stand like a boxer. You want to cusp the saw quite carefully, almost like you're holding a baby bird. People actually work far too hard at sawing. The harder you push, the more that is going to actually grab into the timber. This is a nicely balanced and weighted dovetail saw. The idea of this, the weight on the back of that will help to bring, with gravity, the saw down nice and plumb. When I'm actually starting my cuts, I'm almost holding the saw off the timber, so it's very, very lightly cutting until it gets established. The harder I push down, the more that saw is physically just going to lock up. So the first cut I'm going to do, I've also got my face side facing me. It's going to be the outside of the joint forevermore. I'm going to do my first cut, waist side the line. Again, I'm leaning over the top of that saw. This time I've got to really see if I can just kiss that line. On the waist side of the line, don't leave yourself a millimetre to be chiselling off. See if you can just get that line off the saw. Plumb cut down if you can. See if you can finish him at that shoulder line. Same for this one. I'm looking over the top of the saw. Blowing the dust away as I go. Whoop. Get him down that shoulder line. Same again from here. I'm now going to be sawing waist side the line. And the last one to be cut. Now I've done that with the dovetail, so I've actually got to remove these large sections. For me, I would normally do that again with my piercing saw. So what I'm going to do is bring the piercing saw down this curve cut, get to the bottom, turn the saw over, start cutting through. Starts off that 1 in 8 angle. I need to come square in the middle and back to 1 in 8 in the opposite direction. If I kept the same 1 in 8, exaggerating, I'd end up cutting halfway into my centre pin. So come down here about 11 millimeters deep if we can, a little bit of sideways pressure, start spinning that saw over, slightly above the line, coming across, using all the saw, about halfway, I'm pretty much at 90 degrees. I'll now start coming towards the other 1 in 8. We'll hear the change of tone as the timber gets weaker. And he'll pop out. If you haven't got a piercing saw, then you could use a coping saw, but the coping saw probably is too thick to go inside that kerf line, and what it won't do is be able to turn 90 degrees at the bottom. So for this one, what I will do is start off more in the waist, and I'll do a longer cut and then come back from the other side. You see this wider blade was struggling to get around that corner. I'll flip him over and go back the other way. I would use the coping saw if I was cutting timber which was much thicker or much harder, because the little tiny fine saw here, the piercing saw, might struggle with timber, I don't know, 20 millimeters thick in oak. That's going to struggle. It's a job for the coping saw. So I've got my sawing done. Now it's time for chiselling. I'm going to show you how I can chisel this one in the vise. This is the one I've just done with a piercing saw, and I'm really quite clean and close to my shoulder line. The other one that was done with the coping saw, I've left a bit more timber in there. It's not quite so neat. So rather than doing this chiselling in the vise, I'll take that one in a few minutes over to the bench and do more chopping work instead. For me, I tend to find that actually doing in the vise like this, I can see more what's going on in here. I struggle to see what's happening quite so much when it's down on the vise, down on the bench, but we will have a look. So again, a nice sharp chisel, come down fairly low. I'm not going to go right down to the shoulder line quite yet. I've only got maybe 1 millimetre to come out. I'm going to probably cut 0.5 millimetre, and I'm just going to wobble that chisel slightly side to side, come across and take out some of that waste from here. Break out any bits of timber which are on that shoulder line, and I'm going to bring that chisel down to that shoulder line. It sits in that nice line that I have, and I'm just going to wobble that chisel across. Come to the other part, other half, and the same again. Just a little bit in this corner, just to be taken out. If I flip that timber around, I'll now come across from this other side to remove this section in here. Again, there's probably, a mil and a half to come out. I'm not going to try and do that in one cut. I'm just going to try and take out maybe 0.5 millimetre deep. Just watch here, it doesn't come flying all the way through. I'm gripping it well and truly with my hand here. Just take out small amounts. This chestnut, I say, is quite soft and easy to cut. I would struggle a bit more doing this method if it were a very hard oak. Just a bit more to come down to that shoulder line. So I'll work my way down to that shoulder line, just wobbling that chisel in, just the middle. And into here. I can see I've left a little bit of timber in the middle there. I can physically see that, but I'm hopefully the ruler would show that. I think the middle's clean. If I put the ruler on here and the ruler trick comes back and stops. If I put it on top where I know there's a bit of rubbish, I expect this. Oh, actually it comes back pretty good. Normally it would tend to wobble on there. I'd also, there's a bit in the corner there. Maybe the ruler would show there's a bit left in the corner. Just needs cleaning out into there, and a little bit over the other side as well. If I get my chisel again, just very carefully clean up into these corners. It's the corners that make all of the difference to make a really crisp joint. because I've got a little bit more material in here, I'm actually going to chop this one down onto the bench. I say onto the bench, what I'm actually going to use is my bench hooks. I don't want to be chopping into my bench, that's physically going to protect it. Put them on the bench, use a cramping block, use a cramp to hold it down. I'm trying to cramp this so it's pretty much on top of where my leg is, because then you won't get much bounce. If I put it on the middle of my bench, going to be more bounce than we've got there. Nice solid. Don't put the cramp up that way, you'll end up smacking yourself on the head on the top of the cramp. Get the cramp underneath the bench if you can, just a little bit tight. Let's get him into there, get this positioned. Now either the cramping block could be used just purely for cramping without bruising the timber, or if this is nice and straight and square, you could actually cramp that right onto your shoulder line, and that would protect you from chiselling past the shoulder line. It also means you could basically use that as an upright sort of level to actually give you the correct angle to come down nice and square. I tend to bring it just a bit away from the shoulder line so I can physically see what I'm doing. I'm going to use, I've got a carver's mallet, it could be a carpenter's square mallet. Again, I'm not going to come right down to that shoulder line quite yet. I'm probably going to take this in 2 cuts. All I'm going to try and do is just chop in here, about halfway down, come across the other side, take out a little bit more width-wise. That looks fairly clean. Come back to my shoulder line. I'm trying to get my chisel lined up front to back so it just comes and touches that pin. I don't want to be too far behind the shoulder line. I also want to be fairly upright or very fractionally undercutting, only very, very fractionally. What I don't want to be doing is actually leaving a bump in the middle of my shoulder, because your joint won't come down properly if you do that. You should find the good crisp line quite well. Just bring it across, take out the last little bit widthwise, halfway down, get rid of those bits, flip that timber over. What you also will probably find, because you're using a chopping method rather than the paring method I used before, we'll probably find in the middle of this joint there'll be breakout. Physically the end grain will just break away, because this is a more aggressive cut than my paring that I did upright in the vise. I felt that timber just snap in the middle there. It won't ever actually be seen when the job's together, but you just know yourself that timber's given away, because it's quite a weak timber, this one. Just come back to that shoulder. I'm also doing is leaning my chisel, I'll exaggerate it, 1 in 8 that direction and 1 in 8 here. If you come directly down, you'll end up chopping into the joint. That's looking fairly clean, but I'll always finish up actually in the vise. So I'll take him out, put him in the vise, and just do a last little bit of tweaking. So I'm back to the vise. You can just see here where this end grain has physically broken out, where it was chopped with a mallet compared with the paring. But say, as long as the outside shoulders are clean, that will be fine. I'm just going to come in here back and do some more paring. I can see more what's quite going on within the joint. Just going across that 1 in 8, just removing all these bits, a little bit in the corner there to be removed. Might do that perhaps with a scalpel. Turn him around, look from the other side. Again, just remove any of those little tiny bits that might be in there. Clean these up. A little bit of mess in the corner, I'll leave that in there for the moment. Another thing you can do to actually check how accurate these joints are is, again, maybe take your square. You've got a nice machined section on here as part of the stock. Does that sit in there? Does it sit in there? Does it rock? Will it push up against the end? Is it rocking on anything rubbish in the corner? That one looks pretty clean. This one, I think, I can feel it's rocking, or even that way down, against the bit that's in the corner. So it just gives you an idea of what needs to be cleaned out. The problem with often these joints is, you know, it's not fitting somewhere. It's trying to actually find out which bit is a little bit too tight. I'm just going to flip this joint around and look at, will it go together? I think I've just missed my knife line, just very fractionally, maybe 1/4 millimetre, but it might be a fraction tight on that. I might need to just tweak that. Bring my joint together, face edges to face edge, face side to face side. If you flip this over accidentally, I doubt if it'll fit. It's got to be around this way, the way we marked it. Maybe I'll mark up, or should have done before, an A to an A on there. As I try and put this on, I'm not just going to whack it with the mallet or the hammer. I can feel this side wants to go in. This side feels a little bit tighter, doesn't want to quite go in yet. And I think it is just a fraction here. I can see that knife line is just there. So I'd rather get it finished off the saw, but sometimes it just needs a little tiny tweak. So I'm going to take my wide chisel, I'm going to come just down the grain here. Be very careful doing this, because if the grain, as with this bit of timber, it's nice and straight here where I've actually done my dovetail. At the end here, the timber is beginning to go away a bit of an angle. If you were trying to actually chisel down this where the timber is, the grain's not so straight, the chisel can get caught up in the grain and take out more than you were looking for. Always try and do your joints if you're trying to make life easy in good straight timber. Just a little tiny bit to come off here, and it is a very, very small amount. Not with the mallet, but just paring down. I think that might just about do it. I think we're good to go. So you might find it'll almost go on, with fingers. In fact, it looks like it probably will. But I don't want to wobble it on there, because wobbling it will make it all a little bit looser. A good block. Again, I don't use my mallet. I'm going to use a little hammer, this little cross peen hammer, just to assemble that joint. And what we've now got is a really crisp, incredibly strong joint. When that is glued, that would never be coming apart again. Dovetails are an amazing joint. I think there's a few key elements to make sure you get them right. Getting your tools really sharp, getting your chisels so they really are cutting as you want them, a decent saw. Accurate marking out is going to be absolutely critical. If we can't mark out accurately, we can't cut accurately. Practice your sawing, practice your chiselling. Have a go with just sawing to a line, over and over again. See if you can get that chiselling down to that shoulder line. Good crisp shoulder line, good sharp blades and knives you're going to be using for those. Have a go at practicing at home. Hopefully you can get that really fine tuned. If not, come and see us at the Furniture School. We do short courses on sharpening, getting your planes up and running, and this dovetailing and jointing and a whole range of other bits that we do as well.